B12 absorption is a very interesting topic. Another name of B12 is cyanocobalamin. Why we call cyanocobalamin? Because cyanide combined with the cobalt atom. That's why it is known as cyanocobalamin. Anti-pernicious anemia factor. Because of B12, pernicious anemia do not precipitate it. Extrinsic factor of Cassel. Because intrinsic factor of the Cassel, they secreted from parietal cell. And B12 itself is an extrinsic factor. And it is animal protein factor because most of the time it is secreted, it is originated from animal protein. So it's the water-soluble vitamins. Whatever the water-soluble vitamins, they are dependent for absorption on sodium-dependent secondary transport. And vitamins may be transported to the basolateral membrane and reflux to extracellular spaces. And from extracellular spaces, it is diffuses to the blood. So the transport or absorption of these water-soluble vitamins not depend only on the physiology of the GIT, but also surrounding temperature, cellular energy, and the pH. So all these factors affect the transport of the B12, or you can say water-soluble vitamin. Next slide. Two things important for the absorption. One is the gastric intrinsic factor and the second receptor which is located in the brush border of the epithelium. So we will take one by one. Origin of the intrinsic factor by the parietal cells which also secrete hydrochloric acid. So the parietal cells secrete both intrinsic factor as well as HCl. These parietal cells usually present in the fundus and the cardiac end part of the stomach. In chronic gastritis, there is one symptom that is Achlorhydria. So it is not only necessary Achlorhydria is developed, but pernicious anemia also developed because of lack of intrinsic factor. So what is the main function of the intrinsic factor is the maturation of. So this is a structure. First, orally if we take B12, then what will happen? It combines with the protein of saliva. Then it enters into the stomach and goes into the duodenum. What happens in the duodenum? That because of pancreatic enzymes, this is split up. B12 is split up from the protein which is in the duodenum with the which is present from the saliva. Now B12 is very liable to be degraded by the pancreatic juices. So it combines, at this point, it combines with intrinsic factor tightly. So intrinsic factor, it covered the B12 so that it cannot be digested with pancreatic juice. Now it can easily circulated in small intestine, and in terminal part, then it split up from the intrinsic factor and then absorbed into the blood. Now for the absorption, B12, first it has to combine with the intrinsic factor. Second, there must be receptor, and this combined B12 and intrinsic factor, they are attached to the receptors. After entering into the cell, the endosomes split up the B12 from these receptors. and then from the basolateral surfaces, it diffuses into the extracellular fluid. So there are two binding proteins, one present in the saliva and second which is secreted from the parietal cell, and it is known as intrinsic. So in nutshell, that in the duodenum, the protein which binds with the salivary protein which binds with the B12, this protein is digested by pancreatic proteases. So another protein is required in the form of intrinsic factor. This is a glycoprotein. Now the intrinsic factor is a name named after William Bosworth Cassell. He is an American physiologist, and he find out presence of substance intrinsic factor which act on extrinsic factor, that is B12, and this is essential. B12 is essential for normal maturation of erythrocytes. In the combined form B12 intrinsic factor complex, it cannot be digested by the proteolytic enzymes of Pernicious. Why it is important for the maturation of RBCs? Because B12 is essential for the formation of thymidine triphosphate. It is one of the essential building blocks of DNA. So, absence of deficiency of B12 means diminished or abnormal formation of DNA. And failing to proliferate rapidly. This is a very important point, failing to proliferate rapidly. So what will happen when it fails to proliferate rapidly? That the size become large. Size of the RBC become large and it becomes macrocyte. It become macrocyte. So it become oval instead of biconcave disc. And then they circulate in this form, in the oval form. Now the oxygen carrying capacity is normal, but as it become oval, fragility they become more fragile. So they have short time, short life span. So the deficiency of vitamin B12 or folic acid causes maturation. So whenever there is atrophic gastric mucosa, means there is no sufficient secretion of intrinsic factor and HCl, then what will happen? Pernicious anemia precipitated. So there must be receptor, there must be specific receptor in the storage site. Now, where it is stored, minimum amount of the B12 required each day is 1 to 3 micrograms. Very small amount is required daily. So, for the precipitation of the symptoms, it requires how much time? 3 to 4 years. It requires 3 to 4 years to precipitate the symptoms. Because daily requirement of B12 is 1 to 3 micrograms and it usually stored. So in case of the sprue, we go in reverse direction. In case of the sprue, there is deficiency of the intestinal absorption. intestinal absorption of folic acid as well as B12.